We'll just start.
I think we just start.
Okay.
Y'all ready?
Are y'all prepared? Yeah. All right. So I'm Jessica Frank. I am the user researcher and project manager at Free Law Project. And with me, I have Sam Glover.
Hey, y'all. I'm Sam Glover. I work for the Suffolk University Legal Innovation and Technology Lab. And we build access to justice tools for courts and legal aid organizations, such as online guided interviews and self-represented litigant e-filing tools. Here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about digital infrastructure, free and open source software, nonprofit partnerships, and how you can maybe work in this stuff into the procurement process. We'd love it if you ask questions. I'm going to keep the chat. I'm going to try and experiment here and keep the chat open so we can answer questions in real time. So go ahead and use the chat for our session, and we'll try and incorporate that. Anything you want to say before we kick off?
You want to do intros about our projects? Or?
Yeah, why don't we talk about projects?
Okay, so I am with Free Law Project. We're a nonprofit that leverages technology, advocacy, and data to make legal information more accessible for all. Our main projects are Court Listener, which is a scraper of mostly federal court documents, but a lot of state court cases. We have about 10 million court opinions going back to the 1600s. So if you're a huge history nerd, you can read some of those old case opinions. We also have Recap, which is an archive of over 400 million federal court documents. We have hundreds of thousands of hours of searchable audio for oral arguments. And we focus on advocacy. So things like improving the federal e-filing system and working on promoting neutral citations so that they can be vendor neutral and that have instant access to the authoritative citation. My passion and why I'm here, I'm relatively new to Free Law Project. I was with CALI, the Center for Computer Assisted Legal Instruction, and the project manager for A to J Author for 12 years. But I moved to Free Law Project in September. I have a real passion for access to justice, for self-represented litigants, and for easing the burden on the state court level. Free Law Project has a big focus on federal courts, but I want to push our tech focus into the state court because y'all are handling the burden of the self-represented litigant crisis, and that's where my motivation is to come talk to y'all today.
And I'm here in part to talk about our document assembly line project, which is built. It was conceived during the pandemic when everybody shut down and people were trying to figure out how to resolve that tension between courts as a service and courts as a place and still let people get work done when they couldn't leave their homes. And so David and Quentin and Bryce started building some tools to make it easier to build online guided interviews. And then they built what I believe is the first nonprofit e-filing service provider so that people could take those interviews and get them filed. And by this time next year, we'll have a general purpose front end so that self-represented litigants can essentially file as a Dropbox, a simple, straightforward way to get filings into a system. And so that's all pieces of the document assembly line that we're working on. It's all free and open source, everything that we do. Yeah.
So that kind of leads into our first discussion point on digital infrastructure. So thinking about e-filing, document assembly, legal self-help tools for self-represented litigants as just part of a standard court package, that this is how the justice system should be structured, and these are the offerings that should be available.
Yeah, somebody said it yesterday in a different sense of when will this project be done? Well, when will the roads be done? But you can flip that in reverse too. Like the way the roads and bridges to the courthouse are part of the infrastructure of access to justice, of the justice system. They're digital public infrastructure. And I suppose everybody's sort of feeling that when as we heard from Kansas, when the system goes down and you realize the bridge has just collapsed and you need to find other ways for people to get stuff done. But the infrastructure, I guess I think of court technology as that foundation. Someone said yesterday or the day before is it's the foundation on which innovation can happen. And your case management system, your e-filing system, all that stuff has to be dialed in and a firm foundation for you to build cool tools to resolve your traffic dispute or your your guardianship, whatever, you've got to have that solid foundation. And that's why I think of this as infrastructure.
It's also infrastructure because it's kind of boring, right? It's paving the roads, it's painting the bridge. It's not the coolest new thing. The tech itself is not necessarily figuring out how to fly instead of how to drive. The tech is very boring, and so it can be hard to get infrastructure funding, both in real life and in the court structure. So part of it is that it's mostly some of the problems that we're seeing is not that the tech is hard to implement or that we're doing something all that interesting. It's that the political will and the funding isn't there, which is part of where open source software and partnering with nonprofits comes in. We can help bridge that gap a little bit. It's also, Casey Kennedy was talking yesterday about his son getting the traffic ticket and then being totally offended by not being able to handle it completely on his phone. The next generation of court users are going to expect to be able to do everything remotely from their phone. The idea of taking a day off of work to drive to a courthouse that somebody said their courthouses were structured in a day ride for a horse. Like, that's not going to fly in the courthouse of 2024 or 2044 and the next generation of court users. So it's also building on what is there, but looking towards the court of 20, 30 years from now.
You talked about it being boring, and I can't remember who said this, but they were talking about the iPhone. And the iPhone was a neat toy when it was first introduced. 10 years later, it was boring. Everybody on the planet has an iPhone, which is when it gets interesting. Because when everyone has a smartphone, you can start doing cool things like offering checkout at every hotel. You just expect you can tap a few buttons and get there. And so it is that boring technology that makes for a solid foundation and lets you do really interesting things on top of it. Document assembly, for example, which is what you worked on at Cali, what's part of what we do at Suffolk, is boring technology. This is old technology. You've been able to build and assemble documents mail merge has been working in Word since it was a DOS program, I think. This is boring old technology, but if you get a court that has a lot of its court forms paired with official interviews so that you can assemble documents, the court's getting better input, means there's better outputs. People can use the courts more easily. It makes a massive difference in when you can leverage boring technology.
And a lot of self-represented litigants don't see this as boring technology, right? They're in a situation where they're coming to the courthouse. English might not be their first language. They're dealing with something that is probably the worst thing that's happening in their life. They're incredibly stressed out. They have all kinds of concerns and problems. And the current systems that we're seeing in a lot of places just make that process harder for litigants. They need a little bit more hand-holding. And if you're seeing 50 to 75 to 90% of the people that are coming to your courthouse being self-represented litigants, we need to start thinking about ways in which we can help them that don't necessarily cross the line into unauthorized practice of law, but giving them legal information and a little bit of assistance with guided interviews to get them past the point of legalese or to get the paperwork filed correctly, because it's going to be easier on you all too. If like Sam said, the data coming in is cleaner, the data throughout the system is cleaner, and then the data coming out is going to be cleaner and more structured.
We got a question already about is our open source software hosted in the cloud? And I'm going to punt a little bit on that because I think we're going to touch on that in a few ways as we continue talking. And maybe we should use that to pivot to talking about, okay, so we've made our point that court technology, the front end, the back end, whatever, is a piece of access to justice infrastructure, but why should it be open source? Do you want to start?
Oh man. Okay. One, because a lot of it is government funded, right? So government funded software should be open source and should not be locked into a vendor bubble that other people can't access. It also helps to spark innovation. Open source software is not, something crazy that nobody is using, this sort of nerdy one-off thing. There are a lot of fundamental products that you're working with in your everyday life that are built on open source software.
Yeah, the initial point you made, the Department of Defense has like a guidance memo on open source software that's now, I think it's at least 10 years old. And what they say is government policy should be that if government money is funding this thing, it should be a public It should be public code. The result of it should be public. I am persuaded by that. But essentially what they did is they set the DoD policies is basically like, first you have to eliminate, that's my reading of the policies, first you have to eliminate the open source options, and then you can try proprietary options, because we're trying to build, and DoD, you were mentioning your husband is kind of aware of how much money they spend a lot of money on proprietary software. But when they can, they would rather build open source solutions.
We have some really easy, cool examples of open source software. And if you've been here for the last 2 days, you've been hearing about some cool projects. We didn't even, plant these in the other sessions, but NODS, the National Open Data Standards that the National Center has put together. We saw presentations on Monday about their duplicate recognition, their race imputation tool, their equity and inclusion tool. Those are coming from the National Center. And they're all open source tools. But SAM's...
Well, like the National Open Data Standards is a really good example of how, like, email could not have happened out of a proprietary data standard, right? It has to be open. The reason your Android and iPhones can talk to each other in instant messaging is because of open standards. And NODS is a way for courts to talk to each other. So we're all on the same page. It's a little bit similar to Sally, this sort of a taxonomy of legal issues that enables us to talk to each other. And those kinds of things almost have to be open source. Every time a company comes out with a new chat software that is going to be proprietary, it's going to be dead eventually. It can't last.
I mean, piggyback on the text messaging idea. If you're an iPhone person and you've ever gotten a photo from an Android, you might notice that it's pixelated, it's weird. Or if you send videos to Android, it doesn't come through quite the right way. Because the iPhone is using a proprietary standard that doesn't always map over to the open one that Android is using. I have endless discussions with my girlfriend, her telling me that my phone is crappy and sends crappy videos. And I'm like, it's your iPhone. It's not my Android, but okay. I was like, I work in legal tech. I know a little bit about this. We also have projects. The open source market isn't brand new in terms of legal technology. So A2J Author, the document assembly tool that I used to work on, has been around since 2005. There are 500 to 600,000 people a year who are running guided interviews to get their court documents in states, 44 states across the country. The DocAssemble it's a decade or so now that DocAssemble has been around. So these aren't brand new technologies. Like we said, it's not cutting edge, but it makes a huge difference on the everyday person's impact.
We got a couple questions that I think are relevant here. Andrew Peace asks, open source support is like the wild, wild west. Sometimes you can get an answer to issues easily, sometimes you can't. Fair. One of the advantages, I think, to open source, which I was going to talk about a little bit later, but maybe I can tee up a little bit now, is a lot of times, well, first, it depends, right? Part of me hears, I've heard about so many courts doing cool things here, and what if you didn't have to start from scratch, right? What if you had open sourced this code or what if somebody else had built it so that the next person who wants to build a cool traffic ticket app can start with what you did or borrow some code for you? What if Arkansas and Missouri weren't just getting together and talking about cool best practices, but also, hey, here's the code we used to solve this problem, and then just copy and paste? Like it's a value increase. So not all open source software is the same. The stuff that we do is a big community project. So there is customer support. Every Monday, we have a group of courts and legal aid organizations who are building online guided interviews get together and help each other troubleshoot. So that's one approach to it. A lot of the big projects have community support in the form of online forums, Slack teams, things like that. If you're building your own open source software, then you're your own support. You're your own expert. So it kind of depends on what your intention is for how you want to do that.
I think there's also a marketplace for consultants, right? Like you can have consultants that come in and provide you the customer support, the client relationship that maybe you're looking for if you need a little bit more hand-holding. And when it's open source, it allows that marketplace to come. So if the guardianship people who were on before us need customization because the system doesn't quite fit the relationship that they're looking for, you can hire consultants to come in and customize it for you, or your team can do it. And it allows you to make it configurable to your local jurisdiction and the needs of your court, but still participating in that community of people who do it together. I mean, we heard the CTAC people talk about their Code for Justice. They, in one of the slides they had, said the survey from their community is looking for open source software options. And so we're here to tell you that they exist, that there's people who want to work with you and help create these open source tools.
We got a couple technical questions. Do you have protections in place to make sure that secure coding practices are used? I assume this is a question about sort of crowd submissions, community submissions to changes. And another asks, how do you make sure your code is up to date when using open source libraries that can have frequent updates? Both of those have, I think, similar answers. First, most open source projects do not have a whole lot of community contributors, right? Like our software, the document assembly line software, all of it comes through us. We do 99% of the coding. Most of the pull requests on GitHub are ours. The same for DocAssemble, one of the projects we rely on. That's Jonathan Pyle is the developer. Everything goes through him, and he has his own checklist and he guards it very carefully. So usually what you're doing is if you're using an existing open source project, you're placing some trust in the person or organization that manages that project. And so the question is going to be a question for each project, not in general. For us, we go through every single pull request and we check the code, we check the submissions, make sure it seems right. And if it's something that is mission critical that can't fail, like if it's a course interview or something like that, then we often try it out first and we sandbox it before we approve it. So you'll want to know the coding practices of anything that you decide to subscribe to.
I think you can think of it like a library too. Like the library is open and available for anyone to come and show up and read the books. There's still librarians who are there. There's still like locks on the door at night. I mean, there's still making sure that someone's not walking out with the books. I mean, that's having that sort of overarching organization, be it a nonprofit or a university. They don't necessarily have a profit motive. I mean, we all have to keep the lights on, right? Like the library still has to pay their electric bill. But there's just somebody who's there to make sure that the structure is maintained, that it fits into the current system. But a lot of that's managed through GitHub. I mean, they have, you can get automated alerts on security concerns related to your code. You can do forks. You can see the history of pull requests. That's the other thing with open source. There's a lot of openness about what is happening to the code, and you can follow the trail back to see the history. Lawyers love having a citation. Like the code has all the citations, the history there about who touched it, who added this, and it's not a black box.
On the question of libraries and dependencies, I think it's piece of it is the same way you do now, right? Somebody was earlier in the conference was talking about they have, before they upgrade their case management software, they have a 4 to 6 week testing period, right? You would do the same thing with an open source software that you're going to do. You're still going to test it before you deploy a new version of it. It probably depends on what the software is doing and where you're using it and how critical it is to your mission. But same deal. You're always going to test it before you implement a new version. Maybe it doesn't need to be 4 to 6 weeks, but I'm not here to say anybody is not using the appropriate amount of caution.
And it's also not a step too far. You're already testing, you're already customizing some of your vendor purchase products. We've heard presentations this whole week about how you can't really just take it off the shelf. There still has to be some configuration and some work on it. So you might as well build it collaboratively. You're already sharing ideas. You're already sharing guidelines. You're already sharing process improvement. Sharing the actual tech is not, a giant leap forward. It's the next tiny step that you could be taking.
Timothy from Arkansas says their intent is to open source their software. So good for you. That's awesome. And they're wanting for suggestions for how to do it. If you didn't build it with the intent of opening it, then it's possible there are environment variables or secrets that are built into your code that you'll want to abstract out of the code first. But otherwise, just put it out there. Put it on GitHub. Once you're sure you're not revealing anything, just put it out there and let somebody else decide whether it's useful to them or not.
I think
that's a lot of part of what this is.
There's a lot of good materials out there about what license you should choose to. That's a discussion to have. Yeah. The MIT license, the Affero GNU, depends on how much credit you want to come back, or if you want to allow commercial purchases on top of it, if you want it to be the Wild West and have anybody use it however they want, or if you want to have a little bit more control. So there's some policy decisions that can be built into it. But the being in GitHub, not being a super techie person, the lawyer, there's a lot of material on there to help explain the different licenses. And you can see different examples of projects that use different licenses as well.
We have another question about worrying about security of, say, this is David was asking about the SRL e-filing front end that I mentioned. I'll answer the question generally, and I'll answer it for what we're building. In general, the part of the nice thing about openness is that you can decide if the security is adequate to your needs, right? That's why most encryption algorithms are open source. Like the most secure things that we all rely on are generally open source so that people can try to break them and find weaknesses in them. Openness can increase security, and it tends to. That's why so many security products are open source.
It's the collaboration, right? If you're part of a community who's using the same sort of tools, you can piggyback on that as well. So it's not, I'm in my little office and I'm the only one who knows how to do this in my tool. You're part of a community, and that's sort of what we're promoting here, the taking what CTOC is doing and building on that community nature.
The way we do it specifically for our software is we just don't keep that stuff. It just passes through. We accept it from the user with whatever document, e-filing codes, information that needs to be gone to it. We go through Tyler for the payment currently. We're happy to integrate with other systems, but currently we integrate with Tyler so that Tyler handles the payment. So we don't have any of that information. We hand the documents off to your e-filing management system, and then we're done with them. So security isn't a big issue because we're not holding on to anything. And in transit, we obviously use all of the standard encryptions in transit. We use SSL certificates and all that stuff. But generally, it's in and out. So we're a conduit. Bijal asks again, how is it distributed? How does someone keep up using the same way you do with the software you use now? Right? If you're a Tyler system, you're going to Tyler calls how many times a month or how many times a quarter. Tyler is letting you know what's happening with their software. Open source projects have their own version of the same thing. Periodic updates, release notes, whatever. It's very analogous to what you're doing now, but there are some differences. Maybe we should pivot just a little and talk about nonprofit partnerships.
That it's same but different, right? Like that was my teenage self would always be like same but diff. So it is a relationship that you may be familiar with, and that we've talked a lot about collaboration. And I've heard a lot of people talk about partnerships. And so that is more what it is. It is a partnership rather than a traditional client-vendor relationship. And there are some pros and cons that go along with that.
Yeah, it's the way I like to characterize it, which I think addresses some of the questions we've had already, is, we had a show of hands yesterday, are you going to build or buy? And we hear y'all talking about, are you going to build or buy? There's a middle path there. You don't have to be totally on your own, whether it's with open source software or something else. And you don't have to be totally into a vendor relationship where they're doing it for you. You can do it with someone. And that's what a nonprofit partnership can look like. I suppose there's no reason why a for-profit partnership couldn't look like that either. But I think it comes in handy because we can do things for less because we are using open source software. And so the responsibility for funding the project is shared. We're scrappy and small. And we have a different mission, which I think in some ways aligns much better with eCourts, right? Our mission as a nonprofit is access to justice. It's to serve people, and it's not to make money, which no knock on making money. I mean, go to it. But if you're a software vendor or a custom developer, your goal is to make money. Our goal is to build something that enhances access to justice, which I think is better aligned with eCourts.
Yeah, I think it ties in with a lot of what you're all doing. So you're here, you care about the people who walk in the door as much as they might frustrate you. You still are giving it your all. No one, I don't think anyone is working in the court system because you're in it for the money. And so like Hannah Marquez said, I think it was Monday, she was talking about how her presentation, her colleagues were saying that it was mushy, and it was mushy because she cares about the people that she's working on. And so there was feeling in the presentation of what she was talking about. It's the same idea with nonprofits. Like, we care. Like Sam said, it's in our mission statements to promote access to justice, or to promote open access to the law, to do good, and not necessarily have the profit motive. And we do have to keep our lights on. So a little bit of like honesty here in our discussions. They're not necessarily free tools, because there is some of that. Servers cost money, developers cost money, but the profit motivation isn't necessarily the same. And so it is lower cost. The same way that, paving the roads costs money, but it's not necessarily the most expensive new thing. You're not building rocket ships.
I'd say one of the things that I have seen in building our partnerships with courts, we have a relationship with the Massachusetts Trial Court and the Massachusetts Court of Appeals, where we're helping build interviews, and so we meet regularly with them. But one of the things that requires of the court or the nonprofit legal aid organization that we're working with, whoever is, they have to do some work too, right? One of the reasons you buy software is so that you have to do less work. You still obviously have to do some. You have to you have your own inputs in the project, which we saw during the quarter talks on frustrations between vendors and courts. But if you take that middle path where you're trying to do it in partnership with a nonprofit, you're going to be putting more in than if you have a vendor relationship, but probably less than if you have to do it yourself. That's part of the idea.
Also in the quarter talks yesterday during lunch, they were talking about frustrations that courts have with the traditional relationships. And part of it is a frustration about the outcomes aren't matching the expectations that you were maybe sold that something was going to look like this or do this amount of time. When you're in a partnership relationship, there's more expectation management from the start, right? So going in that you're not just purchasing an off-the-shelf product. You know that you're going to be giving, that you're a subject matter expert in how it's going to work in your court. And so that helps to maybe tailor those expectations and some of the frustration when it doesn't come out exactly when or how you thought it was going to. You have a say in the build part as well as part of a partnership.
Robert wants to know if Mia Bernardi worked with us at Lit Lab. I believe so, but she was before my time, so I'm not positive. I think the reason why I think I said as we're changing slides that I think this is related to some of the questions about keeping up with things is like, if you are in partnership with a nonprofit and if the goal of that nonprofit is to contribute to an open source project, chances are you're going to be much more engaged in some ways with what you're working on. And so, for example, for us, if you were building interviews, your online guided interviews, or you were doing SRL e-filing, or both in partnership with the Lit Lab, we're checking in regularly. You're probably coming to Monday meetings to get support and find out what's going on. We have an online discussion forum. And if there's going to be a breaking change, we'll preview it so that people know what they're going to need to do when they're updating their servers, or if they need to make changes to their interviews and things like that. So it's that collaborative approach, which I think is a little bit different. And in the same way that the project might never be done, it's an ongoing relationship that you stay involved in. If that sounds overwhelming, I guess maybe that's why you don't do it for everything. But
you can never get rid of us.
Yeah,
so never. There's also a legacy here of having done this in other spaces. And so Sam and I both worked with legal aid partners. And so if you don't come from the legal aid world, there for 30 years now have been LSC funded technology innovation grants. Can I remember if it's technology innovation or technology initiative grants?
It's technology initiative grants.
Okay.
I think.
So the TIGs have been funding for cool tech projects. And a lot of these document assembly tools, expert system building tools came out of that funding, but there's also the community there. So we know that this already has worked in the legal aid space. There's listservs where they ask questions like simple, like, I can't get it to do this. How do you guys do it? And 10 people respond in a listserv within, a half an hour, a couple of hours. Or there's an organization, like if it's a DocAssemble question, the Suffolk folks will answer it. Or if it was an A to J author question, I would pop up on the listserv and answer it. And so that community, we've already done this before in the legal aid space. And so it's also not completely out of our wheelhouse to think that community can be built around open source software where people are willing to share. And we saw it here. Like I said, we've seen you all talk about sharing guidelines and principles and documents and strategies. This is the same thing.
I was thinking as you're talking, I was thinking about what Kansas was talking about and how other states chipped in. I mean, that happens every week in the document assembly line community. Like that's standard operating procedure for us, is everybody chipping in and helping with everybody else. And so take all those good feels that you got for a while when your system got exploded. But what if that could just be how you work? I think that is the ideal scenario when you come onto a nonprofit project or partnership, open source project, and you can get some of that community collaborative approach. So
I think it's also not something that like today, if you are like, I love open source, I want to try this out, you're not locked into it forever. Like if you want to test it out and see what the community is like, go hop on those Monday calls that Sam is talking about. Go check out the GitHub repositories. That's the point of open source, is that we're not hiding anything. Come and chat with us or come and look at our documentation. It's out there. And it's also something that you can use to hold up as a standard to vendors when they are trying to set those expectations with you before you sign those big contracts. Come check out some other tools and some other options to see where that expectations are, whether what they're selling is legit based on what you could get for free with open source.
Question about how does identity fit into e-filing solution, however you want. That's one of the nice things about an open source project. A lot of times people will show up at our meetings and be like, I need it to do this. And Quentin will push a pull request later in the week that has that feature. But it is flexible. And, so often there's a unique identifier, often not. For our solution specifically, it's in development. So if you have thoughts on how you would want that to work for your court, we'd love to know about it. But I think it's going to be, as usual, sort of a tug and pull between convenience. Right now you can, so if you're e-filing in Massachusetts, for example, it goes through their e-filing system. So you would look up your court record, you'd create an account with the e-filing, and it would bring you back to the interview to continue. But it can happen in different ways. When we work with a court to integrate e-filing into their system, we talk to them about how they need it to work, and that's how we do it. Jeremy asks for a quick list to different collaborative avenues, how you would do this. And in our materials, you'll see a list of software that we had put together before we knew about NCSC's open source projects. But I would go and look for, if some of those are interesting to you and you want to know more about them, go and look for information. Every project has a web page that will have links to, if there's a listserv, if there's a discussion forum, if there are regular meetings, if there's a Slack group, that kind of thing. So I would go look at the ones you're most interested in is mainly the answer, but in our materials are some ideas to get you started. Yeah. Maybe we should talk about procurement.
Okay.
How does this all fit into procurement?
That's kind of the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily fit into procurement. And the traditional guidelines of putting out an RFP with 1,000 requirements and expecting responses and not being able to talk to any of the vendors after the RFP is released, that doesn't necessarily work for a nonprofit partnership, because it, again, is a partnership and not a traditional client vendor relationship.
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces of procurement. One is like within the traditional procurement process, it is okay for you to require that whatever solution is built will have an open source license, for example. Or you can at least say open source preferred. So you could adopt a policy of, if you're going to build stuff for the court, it's going to be open source, which I would love to see. That'd be so cool. But you can at least, you can also just say, we would prefer an open source solution. If there isn't one, that's okay. We'd prefer that. So one thing you can do is that, and that would be working, I envision that would be mostly working with traditional vendors, but just requiring them to build open source code instead of closed source code.
I also argue that it might be a little bit of a mindset, right? So in preparing for this and in my job, I was reading about how courts sometimes look at software purchases like furniture purchases. Like it's the same as buying a chair or buying a new piece of a desk for the courthouse. And the software and what we're talking about it doesn't fit into those models. So software purchases and this partnership is not the same thing, and it's not going to fit into that same procurement model that furniture or paper or a fax machine might fit in. Except, so I had that already, like software purchases are not furniture purchases, and we've talked about it. And then during the quarter chat yesterday, Thomas McLean from Connecticut was talking about microphones in the Supreme Court building and like wiring up microphones. And he's talking about working with a traditional vendor, and he's doing design, and he's providing detailed feedback, collaboration, helping to influence the design and functionality of the microphones that the company is building. And I was like, oh, it is like purchasing traditional furniture or microphones for a building. So again, it's that one tiny step more than what you might be used to. But you're already doing it when you influence design or you work back and forth with your vendor to get a product that you want out.
I will say too, on the side of nonprofit partnerships, if that's something you're interested in, first of all, consider whether it needs to go through the regular procurement process. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's different money sources that you can use for a nonprofit partnership because it's not typical vendor procurement. When you're not buying software, I guess I would characterize it that you're investing in a project or a product that you need to exist in the world because you need to use it. So you're investing in its continued existence. And if it's a partnership, you're going to have a say in the direction of that project. We're working on a process for our funded court partners to be able to have input in what are the next features we build. Because they're invested in it too. They're obviously invested in it, and they should have that say. But if you do have to go through the typical RFP process, before you have to stop talking to vendors, I don't know if this is true for everybody, but in a lot of procurement processes, once it begins, you're not allowed to talk to vendors anymore. So before that, start a conversation with the nonprofit you want to work with, and make sure that your RFP will be tailored to what you're hoping to get from them. Because nonprofits don't go around bidding on RFPs. Like if all you do is just push RFPs out there and you go, well, we never get any open source proposals or nonprofit partner proposals, that's on you, because that's not how it works. We're a university. If you haven't told us that you want us to bid on your RFP, we probably aren't going to do that, because we wouldn't just do that. We don't have time for that.
It's because we're scrappy, right? We're small, we're scrappy. We don't have the profit motivation to be out there having a grants person or a marketing person spending all day combing the RFPs that come out, because we're spending our time sort of doing other stuff and being lean and agile and all those process words that you hear.
And it is a collaboration. It is not the same as you're not off on your own doing it yourself, but you're also not handing it off to somebody to take care of for you. It has to be a little bit more push and pull and collaborative. And so whatever you're looking for, describe it in your RFP if you can as well. But the words that I would love to see included in RFPs from y'all going forward would be things like open source preferred, or, all code developed under this license must be licensed under the MIT license. Or
you're already putting preferred things in those, right? Like women and minority business preferred, veteran preferred. Again, it's that one more step that you could be doing to take what you're already used to, or what your bosses or your team, your lawyers are used to.
We have a couple more questions, sort of technical questions about security checks, things like that. And I can only talk about our project because, again, these are project dependent. So Bijal asked about unit testing, checks on PR acceptance, things like that. We have an entire unit testing package that we've built for DocAssemble interviews called AL Kiln, just so that every interview can be unit tested, as well as our core software packages. So if it doesn't pass that, it doesn't come through, first of all. But yeah, our policy is everything has to be reviewed before it gets merged with main, and we have protections like that. Different projects are going to have different protections, and that's just going to be specific on the one that you have.
It also depends if you fork the code from GitHub. And so like how much control you set up. Are you taking the open source code, forking it and going your own road? Or are you sort of staying alongside the main branch?
Yeah.
Right. So if you want more control or you want to be on top of it, you don't like how long it's taking them to do certain PR approvals, that kind of stuff, you don't have to follow along necessarily the same pathway that they're going. You can take it and run with it and be as strict or as loose or as Wild West as you want with it.
I guess one of the ways to think that I guess I see this operating is the online guided interviews that courts and orgs are building on the assembly line in DocAssemble. They share a ton of code. But a lot of the sharing there is like, this is, a motion for a protective order in Massachusetts, and this is a motion for protective order in Vermont. They're going to have a lot in common, but they're also going to have a lot that's different. And so they can talk to each other about, how did you solve this problem? Well, it's all open. So here's my code. Here's the line on my GitHub repo where I solved this problem. You can just copy and paste this into your code. And that's a bit like the fork model, where it's still going to be useful back and forth. But they're not all doing the exact same thing. They're just borrowing from each other, and they're leveraging each other's experience and code to do less work overall.
Yeah, I heard someone talk about yesterday, I think it was, about amplifying what you have and doing it for as little as possible. So like I saw it with A2J out there. The sharing isn't necessarily the one-to-one, like I'm taking your protective order and I'm going to implement it wholesale in my state. It was more like, I have to do complicated calculations related to child support. How did you solve that? And what were the calculations that you used? And then the second organization takes that and just changes the numbers. Like the back end structure, as much as courts like to think sometimes that they are so unique and so difficult and their problem is the worst, or their forms are the worst or the hardest. When we see it at a national level, you all are dealing with a lot of the same issues, and a lot of the sharing can come across. The justice from Barbados yesterday, it was at the Quarter Talks, was like, it's so good to see that, Barbados isn't the only one facing this justice gap or this problem. And it's the same idea that the problem when you're in it looks very hard, but when you're in a collaborative environment, some of the load can be taken off by others who have been there before, rather than trying to create from scratch.
I'm sorry, which was, I can't remember. I'm blanking on who built the cool traffic resolution app.
Oh, Judge Tyler, or was in Denton, Texas.
In Denton, Texas, yeah. Right. And so the way I see this working is, if they built that open source, then all y'all sitting in this room who are like, that's cool, we want that. Instead of going to a vendor or sending out an RFP saying we want this, your first call is to Denton and saying, hey, any chance you can, and maybe they're open to this, any chance you can open source that code? What did you build this in? And you start collaborating with them, and now it's Denton, Texas and Springfield, Illinois are building their traffic apps, and they have a lot of stuff in common. And so now they're working on the same code base. Maybe it's different enough that they have to have two separate code bases, but they're copying and pasting stuff back and forth. And now San Mateo, California wants to build one too. And now you have 3 courts that all are contributing development resources to this. And instead of having to build it 3 times separately, you're building it once, and it's just getting better and better and better as you work on it together. And maybe the first thing you abstract is branding, because maybe the code was initially, maybe Denton's logo was hard-coded into the repository to start with. And so you abstract a branding package to make it easy for other courts to do it, and that's cool. And then you start documenting, how do you put in your API stuff so that it can fit into different case management systems. That's some of the power that I see in this is, you take some of the cool stuff you've heard about here and you get a head start on building it in your own jurisdiction.
I think a little bit of this piggies back on I heard for the first time the WIFM, what's in it for me? Yeah. So what's in it for you, right? So you watched Arkansas and Missouri talk about yesterday, the guys there up here on the stage talking about the cool sharing that they're doing, and yes, it worked for us, this didn't work for us, the back and forth. If you're participating in the community, you can go put that show on the road, and you can be presenting about it, and you can be showcasing what your team is doing and how cool your team is doing, and how hey, legislature, we need more funding to do this. And look at how my team is using limited resources to make an impact on 50 million people, or to accept, 1,000 forms where we used to be only able to process, 100 a day. I think Diane Robinson was saying yesterday that the states that have implemented NODS, the National Open Data Standards, their staff time was reduced by 90% in handling data requests that came in. Think about what you could do with all of that extra time and how it could alleviate your staff. So what's in it for you is alleviating staff time. It's sharing what your team is already doing, but amplifying it to make it bigger on a small budget. And it's creating this community that is good for you all and creating efficiencies in the court system, but it's good for everyone. If the justice system works smoother, it works better for lawyers, it works better for clerks, it works better for judges, and it works better for the self-represented litigants who are slamming into the justice system every day in huge numbers.
Maybe we should talk about some important considerations. If you've liked anything we've said and you're thinking about this, some things to consider are, one thing is you brought this up a few times over the last few days, but I like the DoD model, which is if there's open source software, first you should say why it's not good enough. And you phrase that differently as
presumption.
Yeah, if you can't, if your vendor isn't offering you something that is at least as good as a free and open source project, what are they like? Why are you spending that money on development? Because the development is potentially done or mostly done. You're still going to have to customize their thing too. So like if the open source software that is available to solve whatever problem you're having should at least be your baseline. If you can't get better than that from a vendor, why would you go to a vendor?
If you're a lawyer, you had to learn the different levels in like appellate practice about what, where's the presumption and all of that. Like the presumption should be that open source is the answer. And if it's not, like Sam said, you have to balance it against what the vendor is offering.
David says one important benefit is you're freed from licensing, which is generally true. You may have per seat licenses for like to access a server that someone is hosting for you, but obviously the license is open. You don't have to pay per seat. The way we ask courts to support is not seat based either. But that leads me to another thing is we are talking about open source software. I have deliberately avoided putting free on the slide, both because it's an ambiguous term, but because it's not true, right? There may not be a licensing cost, but there is a cost to adopting it. And one of the reasons my project exists in the world is because of a problem that another organization had where it offered stuff for free for long enough that everyone got used to it. And when they tried to pivot for asking everybody to pay it, it became overwhelming. And so you have to go into it understanding what it is going to cost to sustain this project. I don't know if that's directly answering the earlier question about sustainability, but yeah, how do you make sure the servers are going to stay on? You have to go in eyes wide open, even if it's a pilot project about what it's going to cost to keep this thing going. And, the software may be free code, but the servers still cost money. It's probably going to cost a lot less to keep them online than it would if you were paying a vendor to do it for their proprietary software. But you're going to have to put some work into it. So like there's going to be cost in terms of full-time equivalents of staff time. There's going to be some charges for your AWS instance or whatever. So those are all important considerations up front, is have a realistic picture of what the costs are going to be for this project. And if you're going to pilot it, great, but just know going in that if the pilot succeeds, make sure there's at least a tentative commitment to continue. So
yeah, it's infrastructure, right? You have to pay for servers. You have to pay for developers. Your team is going to have to learn potentially a new tech stack. But the cool thing about open source is that going in what the tech stack is going to be and what the requirements are going to be. And there's that marketplace that I talked about for consultants. So if you need more handholding, or if your team isn't quite there, or you need training, or you need extra support, or you have a project that needs to be done, by July, and the open source sort of manager isn't going to be able to make that happen for you, you can hire out for that more customized, but it's still at a lower price because we don't have that profit motivation. There's not that overhead of, money back to the shareholders or the company owners. It's a nonprofit. We have tax guidelines about how much money we can bring in and how we have to use it.
If we are really successful, we have to start lowering the prices.
Right. What is it? The unauthorized or unrelated to business expenses. Like nonprofits actually worry about getting too much money in and having to hire on staff. And so we're not bidding when we do bid on the RFPs at a level that includes profit.
It potentially allows you to take advantage of scale too. Like my position is currently funded, or was initially funded by a grant from SJI. And now the project is also funded by a grant from LSC, a TIG, through Legal Services Vermont. And the mandate of both of those, the deliverable is a national document assembly and e-filing infrastructure. Because when we're hosting a dozen DocAssemble servers, when our e-filing service provider is serving multiple courts, the cost actually starts coming down because the cost to roll out a new instance of that is low. If yours is the only case management system on the server, there is no scale there. There's no ability to scale. But we can do some of that. We also have organizations that are rolling their own because they can, because it's all open, because it's well documented. But there are some potential advantages of scale. The more people using the same system, the more expertise and automation can go into it, the more it's worthwhile building unit tests for it. You can take advantage of other people's testing environments, that kind of stuff. So, Sarah. Diane from NCSC says their time responding to data requests has been greatly reduced by making it readily available online in easy-use dashboards. Can't claim that yet for nods, she says. But, yeah, we do lots of tracking, too. Like Illinois has detailed how many people start an interview, how many people get to the point of finishing the interview, how many file it, and they have lots of tracking around that. You can build all that stuff in, right? It's all open. You can do what you want with it.
I mean, the data on the back end is originally why Free Law Project was interested and opened up my position because they were interested in the data that's coming out of the court system at the back end and not having to scrape court websites to get opinions. Having those dashboards in place where it's easy to access court opinions and court documents in a way that it's supposed to. Obviously, redacted and privileged information is not a bit publicly available, but having clean data going in is why Free Law Project, my boss Mike, initially wanted to get into this so that the clean data can be coming out of the court system as well. So we're interested in helping to build those dashboards, to build the analytics, to build in the reporting that you need. The guardianship people that were here in front of us talking about not knowing how many people are in the guardianship system or under a conservatorship. We can build that in, and your need for that can go into the building of the system as well because you're working in that collaborative environment.
I mean, a lot of the AI y'all have been talking about wouldn't be possible if Thompson and Lexis were still the only repositories of case law. You don't get co-counsel. Thompson may own co-counsel now, but co-counsel was built on fast cases data in large part, which was built on open data. You don't get case law into co-counsel. You never got case law into co-counsel through Thompson. You had to get it through open sources because it was too expensive to build on top of that proprietary sandbox. And so a lot of the AI tools that y'all are talking about that analyze stuff would only be possible because of Free Law Project's work. And that is the power of open, is it allows you, as we kind of where we started, it allows you to build a foundation on which much more innovation can happen. All the cool legal technologies built around analyzing case law and dockets and stuff has an enormous amount of work due to Free Law Project's work.
Yeah, I sat in part of my onboarding with Free Law Projects was to sit in a bunch of meetings with my boss, Mike Listener, and it's all AI vendors who want to know about this kind of case data or from this state or this place. And it's, like I said, you can create a marketplace around open source software. All our actual Court Listener product is all available for free. You can get a big, huge 40 million, 400 million document data dump if you really want, or companies can hook in through APIs and webhooks and do really cool innovation and AI work on top of it.
Yeah.
Are there other?
Yonette asks if open source solutions are available to courts outside the U.S. Absolutely. And in fact, I think like the document assembly line started with courts from several countries. And yeah, there's no reason why you can't adapt this stuff. Some of it is, built with U.S. in mind, but for example, translation and accessibility are some things that we've emphasized in our projects. So it's built to translate stuff, and we're working on AI tools to help accelerate translation. It's built with accessibility in mind so that nobody has to worry about those Attorney General guidelines coming down in 2 years. So those kinds of things are stuff that we build in because they're important to us and that are built into the underlying project that we are working with. Yeah, it's true for some things and not others, but the same thing is true of vendors. If you're looking at those Attorney General guidelines around accessibility that come due in 2027 and you're wondering how to get there, how many of the things that you currently have are going to need to be changed? Maybe it's worth hitching your ride to a project that already emphasizes those things.
I know with A2J Author, it's used in Canada. Their Ministry of their Attorney General basically helps fund a lot of their projects through Community Legal Education of Ontario. Sydney, Australia, then in New South Wales was using guided interviews. It might have not been coming through their court system, but the legal aid organizations. This community they talked about in legal aid is already out there in with their fingers in places that are all around the world. So.
What would you close with?
Okay, so our ask, right? What were we here for? My ask is that I'm looking for court partners. So our motivation is to Free Law Project mostly focuses on federal courts, and I want to turn their tech heads to the state courts, right? So I come from a decade of access to justice, document automation, self-represented litigants in the state courts. I want to turn our tech heads at my organization to you guys and to supporting the project. And so we're looking for 1 to 3 court partners who want to start building cool, open e-filing, open docketing, case management, open data tools. I have ideas, and I think I have some things that might work, like a self-represented litigant portal or an open data platform with dashboards on the back end. But I'm not the subject matter expert on the court system. You all are. And so my ask is if we've sold you, and hopefully we all have 5 stars on the app and you all want to get that NCSE.
We had 5 stars before we started. So
right. So we still do. It can only go downhill. Great.
It wasn't me.
If we've sold you, reach out to us. Like if you want to be a core partner, maybe you have tech ideas and you don't have the tech team or the money to build it, come talk to us. We have some grant funding for the next year with devs ready to start Q1 of 2025, like tomorrow. I'm flying home tomorrow, so don't call me tomorrow. But we're ready for you, and we're looking to start building cool tech that is open source and build out this community as well.
My ask is if you are trying to solve e-filing for self-represented litigants, please talk with me before you build or buy, because we will have a solution in place by this time next year. And if you need it to look different on the front end or you have requirements, now's the time to talk to us because we're still scoping requirements on this and trying to figure out what our MVP is going to be. So I would love to talk to you, especially if you're a Tyler jurisdiction. Tyler has been a wonderful partner for us. They have allowed us to file because we don't make money off of e-filing. We pass through any fees to them. And especially if you're a Tyler jurisdiction, we're already cleared to file e-file with Tyler. We already have an integration built. And so it's easy. And we would love to talk to you about doing this. So before you build your own or buy your own, check us off your list. We should be your baseline.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam and Jessica, for that wonderful presentation. Thanks. Lots to think about.